A few years ago, if you would have told me that Fernando Mendoza would be considered for the #1 overall draft pick, I would have thought you were totally crazy. Going back in time, Mendoza was an unknown two-star recruit from the state of Florida who was lucky to get a Power 4 offer from Cal. Not only did he somehow find a way to get on the field at Cal, but he was actually good enough to become one of the top transfers in the country, and he'd end up going to Indiana. If he could just put it all together, everyone knew Fernando could be a really good quarterback and a big-time draft prospect, and that's exactly what he has done. He is now one of the top quarterbacks in college football, is on some sites the projected #1 overall pick, and currently has Indiana undefeated, and he may be running for a Heisman campaign. He's one of the best players in all of college football, and in today's video, I want to do a spotlight on Fernando Mendoza. How did he go from a two-star recruit to potentially the #1 overall pick? How good has he been at both Cal and Indiana? And how did all this happen? Well, we're going to talk about all of that and more, but before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the insane rise of Fernando Mendoza. So in order to understand how Fernando Mendoza got to this point, we first need to go back in time. Fernando's journey actually started in Boston, but when he was young, he moved to South Miami, where his parents put him in sports early on. His parents were former athletes, as his mom played tennis at Cornell, and his dad rode crew at Brown. His love of football started in elementary school, when he eventually joined the little team known as the South Miami Gray Ghosts. Fernando initially did not like the idea of being a quarterback, but his mom preferred him to play that position due to the lower likelihood of collisions and injuries and concussions and such. However, there was one professional athlete who changed his opinion and perception on the quarterback position. He said, quote, "After watching Tom Brady in the 2011 Super Bowl and saw the amount of influence he had on the team, he was essentially the game manager. He was very intelligent out there, and he knew what he was doing and how he commanded the team. I was naturally attracted to the game of football already, and I was like, I want to be the quarterback." Okay, so he eventually got to Columbus High School, which is a pretty prestigious school, and he joined quarterback alum, including Brian Griese, Mike Shula, and Chris Mason. They were the only D1 quarterbacks to ever come out of Columbus, but Fernando would eventually also join that list, and his little brother Alberto Mendoza would also join that list after he was originally committed to James Madison, but followed Curt Cignetti to Indiana in the class of 2024. So before his sophomore year, Fernando knew he wasn't going to play, but he would have the opportunity to start 5 games due to injuries on the team. Mendoza wanted to play for the Miami Hurricanes growing up, as he literally grew up 5 miles from the University of Miami, and Mendoza's dad was actually friends with Mario Cristobal while they were in high school. When he first started to get into the football recruiting world, he went to a Miami Hurricanes football camp his senior year. When he asked if Miami had any interest in him, the message was, quote, "We might take you as a walk-on." Mendoza said it lit a fire under him. "I was sad, and when I came to the realization I'm not going to be a Miami football player, it was God's path for me." Mendoza was not a highly rated recruit at all, as despite leading Columbus to a Tri-County title during 2020 and a Class 8A state semifinal appearance in 2020 as a senior, he was not a big recruit. He completed 63% of his passes, threw for just under 1,200 yards and 11 touchdowns, and those aren't exactly the biggest numbers in the world. But at nearly 6'6", he had the size. So what happened recruiting-wise for him? Well, he said, quote, "From the start, I started getting some interest from schools such as Georgia Tech, Louisville, Maryland, and others. However, as the recruiting process went on with the shortened junior season, it was mostly offers from FCS schools such as the Ivy League, and Yale was one of them where I ended up committing. This led him to a bit of a whirlwind recruitment, as he had chosen the Bulldogs over FIU, Bryant, Lehigh, and Penn. Then things would eventually shift. He was rated as a 2-star recruit at the time, and he felt the prolonged recruiting dead periods limited his exposure and ability to get more offers. But the Cal Golden Bears coaching staff eventually did take notice and went all in on the quarterback over the last month of that 2022 cycle. Late in the recruiting process, Cal's offensive coordinator Musgrave and the staff decided with his film he could help the program. From there, everything came together very quickly. He was in talks with Alabama to be a preferred walk-on, but Cal popped up late, and they decided to offer him, which he would happily take. He had actually already signed to be with Yale, but because they don't play for scholarships there, he was able to get out of that pretty easily. Why Cal? He said it was, quote, "the most like-minded with his offensive philosophy that he liked, and he'd done a ton of research on the program and school in general, so when it came to things besides football, also the elephant in the room is that this was the only Power 4 offer he had, so of course, no matter what, he's going to want to go there and make up whatever reason possible." I'm sure he did love Cal, though. Many were hoping he would have an impact for the Golden Bears, but nationally, nobody knew about him. He did go 15-4 as a starter his last 2 seasons, but according to 24/7 Sports, he was a 2-star recruit, the number 140 quarterback, and the 2,149th best player in the class of 2022. Pretty crazy, huh? Yeah. So how would he end up doing in Berkeley? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. Personally, Mendoza is one of my favorite quarterbacks in college football, and I actually first heard about him when I did a feature on Cal's quarterback room back in 2023. But in 2022, I guess Cal fans knew about this guy, as apparently he was starting to impress in practice. He was a surprise through the first week of training camp, and while there was no threat of him taking over Jack Plummer or Kai Milner at the top of the depth chart, he was making the most of his opportunities and showing he at least did belong at the Power 5 level. Yeah, so Mendoza ended up not playing at all in 2022, but 2023, he would get an opportunity. With both Milner and Plummer transferring away, the main starter was supposed to be Sam Jackson. Jackson ended up having a decent start, but he got hurt. By the end of the season, Mendoza was then thrown in with the Wolves and told to figure it out. He'd play heavy duty in their last 7 games, throwing for 207 yards and 2 touchdowns in his first career big-time game against number 15 Oregon State. Then he'd followed it up with 2 more scores against both Utah and USC. Unfortunately, the first 4 games that he played in all resulted in losses, but he showed a lot of potential. He had 2 touchdowns on the ground and 6 through the air. Pretty dang good for a redshirt freshman. Mendoza would end up on a high note, as he'd end up beating Washington State 42-39 with 2 touchdowns without a pick. Then he'd have 3 scores in a win on the road against Stanford and 2 scores in a win over UCLA. Mendoza had gone 3-4 as a starter, and then he'd get an opportunity to start in their game against Texas Tech. Unfortunately, the Independence Bowl did not go according to plan, as they got blown out 34-14, and Mendoza threw 3 interceptions. But he did have 261 yards. In total, Mendoza threw for 1,700 yards, with 14 touchdowns and 10 picks, and 2 more scores on the ground. He was named one of the Pac-12 Freshmen of the Year, and obviously had plenty of potential going into 2024, but he would have competition. Chandler Rogers had played plenty of college football, and he had transferred in from North Texas, and he was hoping to win the starting job. But after just a couple of games, it was obvious that not only was Fernando the future of the program, but could be a bright star in college football. In their first game against UC Davis, he'd end up throwing for 158 yards and a touchdown. But his real magic came in week 2. Against Auburn on the road, an SEC school, Mendoza would go into Jordan-Hare, throw for 233 yards with 2 touchdowns, and didn't have a single interception. He helped beat the Tigers 21-14, and their plan of playing both him and Rogers had now evaporated. He completely pulled away and was now the guy. He actually completed 17 of his first 18 passes in that game, and he was only sidelined due to a small injury. But a couple weeks later, he'd have one of the biggest games of his life, as after losing to Florida State, he'd now play at home against number 8 Miami, and College Game Day was here. Remember, this was the team that did not offer him that he wanted to be a part of. He said he had no bad blood though, and would refuse to do the upside down U or anything like that. He respected Miami, and unfortunately I guess some could say it came back to bite him, as pretty much nothing went his way. There were a couple late, weird, controversial calls, and after Cal got off to a hot start, they'd end up losing 39-38. Mendoza only completed 11 passes in that game, which was the lowest of the season. From there, Cal started to lose more football games, as they then lost to number 22 Pitt, and by 1 to NC State, but luckily, he would finish the season on a tear. Against Oregon State, he threw for 364 yards and 2 touchdowns. Against Wake Forest, he threw for 385 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then finally against Stanford, he threw for 299 yards and 3 touchdowns. Sandwiched between those games was also a loss to Syracuse, and after being sidelined for the remainder of the season due to an injury, Mendoza in total finished with 3,000 yards, 16 touchdowns and 6 picks, and once again 2 rushing scores. Mendoza ended up having a really good season, and also this came in light of a terrible offensive line, a pretty inept offensive system, and not many good weapons. Mendoza put up crazy numbers despite not having much help, and his potential was pretty much endless. While at first some thought he could end up going to Miami or Georgia, or somewhere really big like that, I personally knew it was going to be Indiana all along because of a hidden secret I knew. Okay, newsflash, it really wasn't much of a secret, but his little brother Alberto Mendoza was a 2-star recruit who flipped from James Madison to Indiana when Cignetti ended up going there. After Alberto never entered the portal, to me it made logical sense that Fernando would consider Indiana. His brother was there, Curt Cignetti was fresh off of the best season in school history, and Cignetti turned Curtis Rourke from a guy who no one talked about to all of a sudden probably a day 3 draft pick, and the most efficient quarterback in college football. To me, it made a lot of sense, and with him being gone, Mendoza would step in and be the starter, and that's pretty much exactly how the script went. Mendoza committed to Indiana, making this a huge get for the Hoosiers, and also I think this is a pretty good career move for Fernando. In his 2 seasons at Cal, he threw for 4,700 yards with 30 touchdowns, and also ran for 4 more. He was considered one of the top overall players in the 2025 transfer portal, and the number 4 overall quarterback. This came after he finished second in the ACC in completion percentage, third in passing yards per game, sixth in yards total, and eighth in touchdown passes. He would obviously arrive at Indiana with plenty of hype, but some thought that he was overrated. Many media pundits labeled him as one of the more polarizing quarterbacks in the country, as some sites thought he could be a first-round draft pick, and others thought he wouldn't be all that good. Well, we would just have to find out during the 2025 season, as Fernando would obviously win the starting job and would make his debut against Old Dominion. Honestly, this game was not all that impressive, as Mendoza went 18 of 31 without a single passing touchdown. He did end up having one rushing score, and they beat the Monarchs 27-14, and this did not do anything to raise his stock. But over the last 4 games, Mendoza has gone insane. It would start in week 2, as at home against Kennesaw State, Mendoza would throw for 245 yards with 4 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. They would kill the Owls 56-9, but again, this was bad competition. It wouldn't change much the following week, as they would beat Indiana State 73-0, but Mendoza had 6 touchdowns in that game. He would complete 95% of his passes, and he was now starting to skyrocket. But now he'd have to play against some better competition, as a top 10 Illinois team would come to town. In one of the biggest wins in school history, Indiana would absolutely skull-crush Illinois 63-10. Mendoza would go 21 of 23 for 267 yards and 5 total touchdowns. He had still managed to not throw an interception through his first 4 games, and he completely dismantled the Illinois secondary. A lot of people are downplaying this win now, but if it weren't for this absolute beatdown, Illinois would still probably be in the top 10. This past weekend, he would make his first career start on the road for Indiana, as against the Hawkeyes, he was tested. This game did not go according to plan, but after a late interception, Mendoza would have to have a game-winning drive to keep Indiana undefeated. He ended up throwing a touchdown to Elijah Surratt, and Indiana would go up 20-13. After a late defensive stand, Indiana would end up winning, and Fernando Mendoza ended up running back to the end zone and took a safety, which was definitely a very unique situation, as I feel like there was a lot of risk to that, and he could have just slid down anywhere else, but it made a lot of people who bet on sports pretty mad, and I found that pretty funny. But he still finished with 233 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he did throw his first interception on the season. Indiana is currently 5-0. The Hoosiers have a real chance at going back to the college football playoff, and Mendoza is now getting attention to be the number 1 overall pick. Sure, this quarterback class seems to be a little bit down compared to usual, and right now Mendoza's the shiny new toy, but there is a good chance that this actually lasts and that he becomes a first-round draft pick. At 6'6", Mendoza has the height, he has the arm, and now he is putting up the stat. I'm no football scout, so I can't really give you a detailed breakdown on Mendoza, but in my opinion, he also passes the eye test and seems to have that it factor. He ended up making the game-winning play to beat Iowa, which is really tough to beat on the road, and we'll have to see how he can do in 2 weeks against Oregon. This will be the biggest game of his college football career, and if he can somehow lead the Hoosiers to victory in that one, he'll definitely be a front runner for the 2025 Heisman Trophy. That is a huge what if though, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. For now though, Mendoza is one of the top quarterbacks in the country, as he has 1,208 yards with 16 touchdowns and 1 interception, and nearly 100 yards and 2 more touchdowns on the ground. We'll see how he does in the back half of the season, but what do you guys think? If you're an Indiana fan, how good do you think Fernando Mendoza is? Do you think he'll end up being a first-round draft pick? And what other players should I do a spotlight on next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out one of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.